If orcs have dreams, then surely Turin, son of Húrin, is the stuff of their nightmares. Over the span of a single year, he is going to rise from outlaw captain to absolute legend of Middle-earth, a lord of his own land. And at the end of this year, the time will come for his greatest battle yet. A fight to determine his future, a war for the fate of the wild. Maya Govan and Melanin, and welcome to another installment in this series explaining and breaking down Tolkien's epic First Age tale of the Children of Húrin. Over the past few videos, I've talked about Turin's time as the captain of the Gauderwaith, the outlaws, the wolfmen of the wild. I've talked about his delightful friendship with the epic elf Beleg Cuthalion, his complex friendship with the mannish outlaw Androg the Archer, and his intensely complex friendship with the semi-sinister, but also semi-sympathetic, petty dwarf Meme, whose caves within the Red Hill of Amon Rudh are now being used as a home and a stronghold by Turin's Gauderwaith. But among this unlikely band of wild outlaws, not everything is tranquil. Meme hates Androg for unknowingly, but still kinda intentionally, killing his son. Androg hates Meme for cursing him and forcing him to break his own bow and lay it at the feet of Meme's dead son, and they both absolutely hate Beleg for being an elf. Beleg himself, of course, does not hate anyone. Beleg is wonderful, but it seems that the only thing keeping the Gauderwaith of Amon Rudh together is that all of them agree on one thing. Turin is their captain. They will do as he commands, and under his leadership, they will be reforged into a fighting force that will stand against the Dark Lord Morgoth, that will keep the wild free of him for just a little bit longer. Now, there is a lot of super awesome stuff to talk about in regards to Turin and Beleg and Androg and Meme and the rest of the Gauderwaith, but before I crack on with it, I want to first take a look at the lands of Beleriand as a whole, and specifically look at them from the perspective of Morgoth himself. Because by this time in the First Age's history, which by the way is 519 years after Feanor and his rebel Noldor first arrived in Beleriand and began the War of the Jewels, anyway, by this time, that war is very much going in Morgoth's favour. He hasn't quite won, not just yet, but it does now seem pretty impossible for him to lose. The northern highlands have fallen. The northwest has fallen. The northeast has fallen. The passes of the river Sirion have fallen. The armies of Morgoth roam relatively freely through Beleriand, and to appropriate some language from the Lord of the Rings, the enemies of Morgoth, the free peoples, are now pretty much confined to these metaphorical islands surrounded by a sea of many perils. And there aren't even that many islands of resistance left. In a few of these videos, I have mentioned a book in the History of Middle-earth series called Morgoth's Ring. And the title of that book can be a little bit confusing because Morgoth never forged a ring. However, what this title is referring to isn't a literal piece of jewellery, like a ring of power. It is instead a metaphor for Beleriand itself. As we all know, in the Second Age, Sauron forged a ring, and into it he poured his malice and his dominion and his own life force. That ring is imbued with a part of Sauron's essence, and so long as it exists, he cannot be fully destroyed. And in the First Age, Sauron's former master, Morgoth, does a very similar thing. Except instead of pouring his malice and his essence into a ring, he pours it into the land of Beleriand. He is slowly infusing this country with his own evil life force, corrupting the home of his enemies, and he knows that if he succeeds, there will be no way to destroy him without also destroying the entirety of Beleriand. Beleriand is Morgoth's ring. So, by this point in the story, corrupting and conquering all of Beleriand is Morgoth's ultimate mission. And so, the orcs come in ever greater numbers. They recapitalise on the absence of Beleg Cuthalion, and they reconquer Dimbar, infesting the land just to the north of Doriath's border. While the Dark Lord sits upon his dark throne, weighing up his malice, he receives tidings from spies and traitors and other sneaky servants, and in the eyes of his mind, he understands far more of the deeds and purposes of his enemies than even the wisest of them feared. Except for Melian the Maya. To her often his thought reached out, and there was foiled. Queen Melian represents the most powerful of all Morgoth's enemies in Beleriand, but even she cannot withstand him in the long run. She is a wise and mighty Maya, but back in the day, Melkor was the mightiest of all things created by Ilúvatar, and the Dark Lord has time on his side. Every year, the might of Angband grows. Every spring, his orcs defile more and more land, and every year his enemies diminish. By now, there really are only a handful of places in all Beleriand that could put up any kind of meaningful resistance. And so it is to those last bastions of resistance that Morgoth is now turning his full attention. So, the most iconic of all these islands amid a sea of perils is of course the super secret city of Gondolin. This is the place that Morgoth fears most. Gondolin is not a community of refugees. Gondolin is an immensely powerful kind of city-state ruled by King Turgon, second son of the former High King of the Noldor, Fingolfin. And it is occupied by the last great army of the Noldor left in Middle-earth. But Gondolin is hidden, and for now there's not much Morgoth can do except desperately try to find it. The second great threat to Morgoth's dominion is of course the Sindar kingdom of Doriath, ruled by High King Eleuthingol and Queen Melian the Maya. However, unlike Gondolin, Doriath isn't a particularly significant military threat to Angband. There's only been one pitched battle between Morgoth and the Sindar, and that was a very long time ago, before the Noldor even arrived in Middle-earth. It's true, there are a few staggeringly badass individuals from Doriath, Beleg and Marblung being the main two, and they do their best to protect their neighbours, the vulnerable woodsmen in the forest of Brethiel, but at the end of the day, Doriath's power lies in defence. defense. They might slow the spread of Morgoth's minions, they might even stop them in some places, but they are never going to overthrow Angband. However, as long as Melian is queen, Angband can also never overthrow Dor-Cúarthol. The third great stronghold of Morgoth's foes is Nargothrond, further to the south, the underground elvish kingdom that was founded by the fundamentally fabulous Finrod Felagund, but is now ruled by his younger brother, or potentially his nephew, depending on which version of the family tree you go with, a guy called Orodreth. And, in some ways, Nargothrond can be thought of as a coming together of Gondolin and Dor-Cúarthol. Just like Gondolin, Nargothrond is exceptionally secretive, and as of right now, not one of Morgoth's servants have ever found it. To them, it is only a name of fear. However, a little bit like Dor-Cúarthol, Nargothrond is a predominantly defensive kingdom. They have sent out warriors to fight in both the Battle of Sudden Flame and the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, but for the most part, the elves of Nargothrond now favour stealth and ambush over pitched battles, and they prioritise guarding their secret borders over all other things. So, Gondolin, Dor-Cúarthol, and Nargothrond, they are the big three. The three places that Morgoth is going to have to destroy in order to win. Now, there are one or two other places in Beleriand, havens, where some elves and men dwell relatively safely beyond Morgoth's reach, but these aren't like bastions of opposition, they are shelters for refugees. By far the most relevant of these havens can be found about as far south in Beleriand as south goes, right down here, at the very bottom of the map. After the recent battle of Unnumbered Tears, the coastal havens of Eglarest and Brithombar were overrun and destroyed by orcs, and the lord of these coastal havens, Círdan the Shipwright, my joint favourite elf of all time, along with his sort of foster son, his ward, future High King of the Noldor Gil-galad, led his people on many grey ships to the island of Valar, just off the coast of Beleriand, where it is hoped that they will be safe, at least until all else has fallen. And Círdan and Gil-galad have also established a safe haven for Elvish and Mannish refugees right here at the mouths of Sirion. But as I say, this is not a place of warriors. This is not a stronghold that can ride out and do battle against Morgoth. It is a literal last hope for many, many displaced people whose homes have already been conquered. There are one or two other places that Morgoth hasn't yet quite brought under his dominion. Don't forget about the woodsmen of Betrayal, who I think Morgoth simply doesn't consider important enough to be worth wiping out just yet. And of course there are the Blue Mountains in the east where the dwarves live, and also the summery southern regions of Osiriand where the sons of Feanor are currently hanging out. But unlike all the other places that I just mentioned, neither Osiriand nor the Blue Mountains are going to be a particularly relevant part of this story, so I'll come back to them in future series. However, right now, there is one more place to talk about. One more island in a sea of perils that absolutely is resisting the Dark Lord's conquest. Let's put ourselves back in Morgoth's point of view for just one more moment. It's been 537 years since he returned to Beleriand with Feanor's Silmarils. It's been 518 years since his armies fought their first battles against the Sindar and the Noldor. It's been 425 years since the construction of Gondolin began, and 387 years since the completing of Nargothrond. Also, Doriath has already been a thing for over 3,000 years. So, the point is, Morgoth has had a good few centuries to figure out exactly who his main enemies are and what their strength is. But then, almost overnight, a brand new enemy has suddenly appeared seemingly out of nowhere, wearing the Dragon-helm of the chieftains of the House of Hador. When Morgoth sent orcs and other evil things to attack the eaves of the Forest of Betrayal and to hunt for signs of Nargothrond and just to generally make this part of Beleriand as awful as the north, they first had to pass pretty close to the Red Hill, to Amon Rudh. And so, Morgoth is swiftly forced to realize he now has a brand new enemy to conquer. Not some vulnerable woodsman of Betrayal, not some secretive wood elves of Nargothrond. Instead, these are dangerous wolf men of the wild. Outlaws, under the command of the man who, arguably, hates the Dark Lord more than anyone else in all of Middle-earth. An enemy whom Morgoth's servants are very right to be afraid of. So, in the spring of this year, 489 of the First Age, Turin turned 25. And at that same time, he and his elvish buddy Beleg became two of the most epic warrior friends in, all of Middle-earth's history. We are told that when Turin first joined the Gauderwaith, there were about 50 of them, although sickness and war, and also Turin himself, have now caused that number to dwindle. However, due to the woodcraft of Beleg and the valour of Turin, these fewer than 50 outlaws seem to their orcish enemies like a full host of warriors, a wild terror upon the Red Hill. The orcs that came south were spied by the outlaws, they were hunted in the wilderness, and when they gathered in even larger numbers and marched to war as a full force of orcs, they would be ambushed by the Gauderwaith in some narrow place, and the last thing that these orcs would ever see would be the Dragon-helm and his men, tall and fierce, leaping from the shadows of the trees. Before long, the very sound of the outlaws' horns would cause the orc captains to quail in terror, and eventually it got to the point where the orcs would simply turn and flee from Turin's lands before any arrow whined or any sword was even drawn. Such was the dreadful terror that Turin and Beleg inspired in the servants of their enemy. However, it's not just Turin and Beleg being absolute badasses here. We also have to talk about the Gauderwaith's second-in-command, Arndrog. As I've already mentioned, Arndrog the Archer absolutely hates Mime, the petty dwarf. Arndrog kind of accidentally killed Mime's son, and in retribution, Mime afflicted Arndrog with a dwarvish curse. Mime declared to Arndrog, "He that loosed the shaft shall break his bow and his arrows, and he shall never take an arrow nor bear bow again. If he does, he shall die by it." And so, whilst all of this epic awesomeness is going on with the hunting of the orcs in the wild, Arndrog the Archer is forced to give up on archery for fear of Mime's curse. However, it wasn't long before Arndrog began to question if a dwarvish curse really was all that powerful, and when another warband of orcs strayed too close to the slopes of Amon Rudh, Arndrog defied Meme's curse. He took up a new bow and he went out to do battle with these orcs. But even though the orcs were all slain, and the outlaws' home of Barn Danwedd remained utterly untouchable, it turns out that Arndrog absolutely did underestimate the curse of Meme. In the fighting, Arndrog was shot by a poisoned orc arrow, just as Meme declared he would be. And he is brought back to Barn Danwedd, dying and in agony. I imagine Meme was pretty stoked to learn of this, but as it goes, he too underestimated the power of one of his nemeses. Because although the wolfmen, the Gaurwaith, typically have very little in the way of skill in healing, that is not true of Beleg. We already know that he is one of the finest healers alive in Middle-earth at this time, and he uses his elvish gifts to heal Arndrog's wound, to draw out the orc poison, and to bring him back from the brink of death. Thus it was that the curse of Meme the Petty Dwarf was overturned by the healing hands of Beleg Cuthalion. Now, the bad news is that the hatred that Meme bore to Beleg was increased still more after this event, and although Beleg undid Meme's curse, the dwarf says to himself that it will bite again. But there is good news too, because don't forget that prior to Arndrog's mortal wound, he and Beleg were absolutely not friends. In fact, the only thing that Arndrog and Meme have in common is that they both kinda like Turin, and they both absolutely despised Beleg. And yet, things are now beginning to change on that front. When Arndrog first met Beleg, he tied him to a tree for multiple days, he starved him, he ordered his torture, and he would have had him executed if Turin hadn't shown up in time to prevent it. But because Beleg is such an immensely wonderful person, none of those things stopped him from saving Arndrog's life when he was in need. And so, although Meme's hatred towards Beleg has increased significantly, Arndrog's hatred is lessened, and he finally seems able to not only make peace with the elf, but even to befriend him. After his near-death experience, Arndrog does seem to come across as a much more reasonable and even heroic outlaw. Anyway, as this year moves forward and spring turns into summer, things only get more awesome for Turin and Beleg. Rumours of these two captains travel far and wide throughout Beleriand, and in time it becomes well known to all the enemies of Morgoth living hopeless and desperate in the wastes that the Strongbow and the Dragon-helm represent a new hope, a refuge where evil things cannot endure. And so, slowly but surely, many wandering peoples, both men and elves, who went leaderless, dispossessed but undaunted, remnants of battle and defeat and lands laid waste, took heart again, and came to seek the two captains. From all across Beleriand, homeless and hopeless people take new hope in these tales of the helm and the bow, and they seek out the two heroes until eventually the ranks of Turin's resistance is reinforced with great numbers, and his followers swell into a great fighting force, almost an army of rebels. Upon the advice of Beleg, Turin welcomes all of these newcomers, but he does not permit them to dwell on Amon Rudh or within the Gawrwaith's home of Bar in Danwedd. Instead, he establishes many other guarded camps and makeshift forts just to the south of the Red Hill, and over time his territory expands more and more until eventually it spans this entire swathe of land, not much smaller than the Kingdom of Dor-Cúarthol. And right in the centre of Turin's territory is Amon Rudh, from which Turin can look out at all the lands under his influence, and all those living in his lands can look up at the stronghold of their mysterious captain. Turin does a number of breathtakingly epic things during his relatively short life, and this has got to be towards the top of that list. 5 years ago, he was a prideful young guy, only 20 years old, who made the foolish decision to leave his home in Dor-Cúarthol and to flee into the wilds without anyone or anything to help him. But only 5 years later, he is the lord of his own land. He dwells in secret caves within an immensely strategic hill. He is an astonishingly troublesome wrench in Morgoth's attempted conquest of Beleriand, and he is renowned among all free peoples. I kind of imagine him at this point in the story as sort of like the Spartacus of Middle-earth. And yet, apart from Beleg, no one actually knows who this captain truly is. The Gawrwaith still call him Neathan the Wronged, but among the newcomers to this land, Turin takes up a new name for himself, Dor-Cúarthol, the Dread-helm. And as the might and reputation of Dor-Cúarthol grows and spreads about Beleriand, Turin names all of these wild lands beneath his lordship, and he claims them as his own country. Dor-Cúarthol, he calls it, which in Sindarin means the land of bow and helm. And so, before this summer even came to an end, Dor-Cúarthol, the lord of Dor-Cúarthol, has become a bit of a household name throughout this part of the world. And after the following of Turin had swelled to a great force, and the power of Angband was thrown back, even the highly secretive elves of Nargothrond began to really pay attention to the land of bow and helm. As you will already know, the secret underground elvish stronghold of Nargothrond was originally founded by Galadriel's eldest brother, the flabbergastingly fantastic Finrod Felagund. But during the tale of Beren and Luthien, Finrod was of course slain by one of Sauron's werewolves. And so the ruler of Nargothrond during this story is Finrod's younger brother, or potentially his nephew. Honestly, in this instance, it really doesn't matter. Finrod's younger and slightly less awesome kinsman, the now king, Orodreth. When word reaches Orodreth's people that an outlawed mortal man is causing such hurt to the enemy, many of the elves grow restless, believing that they should take a leaf out of this Dor-Cúarthol's book, and they too should ride out and make open war against Morgoth. However, Orodreth refuses. He knows that Nargothrond's strength lies in its secrecy, and although he absolutely is the king of this little kingdom, in all things he followed Thingol, the High King, and Orodreth's great uncle. And, right, the truth is, relative to some of the other Noldorin lords of the First Age, Orodreth is not the most spectacular. He's a good guy, and I do think he's sometimes a little bit unfairly criticised, But he doesn't have the strongest will in the world, that's certainly true, and he does tend to do whatever the most convincing person at any given moment tells him to do. But he is not without intelligence, and Tolkien tells us he was a wise lord according to the wisdom of those who considered first their own people, and how long they might preserve their life and wealth against the lust of the north. Therefore he allowed none of his people to go to Turin, and he sent messengers to say to him that in all that he might do or devise in his war, he should not set foot in the land of Nargothrond. But help other than in arms he offered to the two captains should they have need, and in this, it is thought, he was moved by Thingol and Melian. And so we can presume that Orodreth probably did send stores of food and provisions to Turin's vastly growing group of followers on Nargothrond's doorstep, but he sent no warriors to join their fight. Turns out, though, from Turin's perspective, it would seem he doesn't really need them. Things appear to be going really, really well for the rebels of Dor-Cúarthol. But don't be fooled. This is not a happy story. And as horrendous as Morgoth obviously is, he does kind of know what he's doing. As this summer wears on, Morgoth launches assault after assault. And although each one of these attacks ends with total victory for Turin and his rebels, what Turin does not realise is that Morgoth's assaults upon his land are only a deception, only feigned attacks, so that by easy victory, the confidence of these rebels might become overweening, as it proved indeed. Morgoth is basically throwing away many orc lives for the sole purpose of instilling overconfidence in his enemies. Now, probably it goes without saying, of all the warriors in Dor-Cúarthol, there is one who displays far greater wisdom than all the others. One who is kind of able to see through the machinations of Morgoth, and that is, of course, the other captain, Beleg Cuthalion. One day, after Turin and Beleg have just taken out another warband of orcs, Turin perceives that his best friend seems sad and thoughtful. So Turin asks what's up, and Beleg answers, "The wrath of Angband. We have burned the fingertips of the Black Hand, but no more, and it will not now withdraw." Now, to this, Turin replies, "Is not the wrath of Angband our purpose and delight?" But this conversation highlights a very significant difference between the fighting styles of the Dragon-helm and the Strongbow. In one of Tolkien's alliterative verse poems, known as the Lay of the Children of Húrin, which was constructed somewhere between 1917 and 1924, so decades before this version of the story existed, Tolkien wrote, "Thus Turin who trusted to targe and sword, who was fain of fighting with foes well seen." A targe is a type of round medieval shield, and fain in this context means pleased to. So in other words, Turin much prefers open warfare as opposed to, like, sneaky warfare. But Beleg is the opposite. He recognizes that Turin is truly talented when it comes to killing orcs upon the field of battle, but he also recognizes that he may be too talented for his own good, too successful at slaying Morgoth's servants. Which reminds me a little bit of that other outlaw band that we see play a prominent role in the Silmarillion. The outlaws of Barahir, father of Beren. At the beginning of Beren and Lúthien's story, we are told the rumour of the deeds of Barahir and his companions went far and wide, and Morgoth commanded Sauron to find them and destroy them. If you're gonna dedicate your entire life to resisting Morgoth's dominion of the wild, it would seem that it's wise to fly beneath the radar. If you are too competent, you'll get noticed and eventually destroyed. That's what happened to Barahir, and it's not a million miles from what's going to happen to Turin. They are both just too heroic for their own good. And remember, although Morgoth cursed Húrin and has held him captive for 17 years now, he never did find out what became of Húrin's son. From the Dark Lord's perspective, Turin has been a mysterious loose end. He's afflicted with Morgoth's curse, but until now he had long been lost in the shadows and under the veils of Melian, beyond the knowledge of Angband. Except that now Turin has made himself renowned by putting on the Dragon-helm of Húrin's grandfather. He named himself Dor-Cúarthol, the Dread Helm. He named his territory the Land of Bow and Helm. And so, eventually, rumour of this mannish hero, wearing the iconic ancestral helm of Húrin's house, reached Morgoth in Angband, and he laughed. For now Turin was revealed to him again. But it's not all good news for Morgoth. There is a part of him that is afraid of the son of Húrin, and Morgoth began to fear that Turin would grow to such a power that the curse that he had laid upon him would become void, and he would escape the doom that had been designed for him. This is a pivotal moment in Turin's life. Morgoth himself is acutely aware that Turin has the potential to undo all the evil that has been designed for him. He might have the power to overcome his curse, or he might retreat back to Doriath and be lost from the Dark Lord's sight once again. But, as we all know by now, Turin simply cannot bring himself to go backwards in life and return to Doriath. He cannot bring himself to forbear the Dragon-helm of his ancestors, and he cannot bring himself to give up on his victories in open battle and let fear of the Dark Lord dictate his actions. And so, Morgoth takes advantage. He decides that killing Turin is just not cruel enough, and in the darkest recesses of his mind, he decides that Turin must be taken, carried back to Angband alive, and there he will be tormented, tortured, and enslaved, just like his father. And so, Morgoth sends more of his servants into the south, towards the hill of Amon Rudh. But unlike the previous warbands we've seen, these servants of the enemy aren't so much soldiers as they are his most skilled scouts and spies. And these spies are commanded to lurk unobserved in the wilderness and to make no move against the rebels until the time is right. However, despite Morgoth's demand for secrecy, there is one among the rebels who fairly swiftly does become aware of these orcs spying about his home. Unfortunately though, it is not necessarily the rebel that you would want knowing something that no one else knows. You see, it is Mime, the petty dwarf, who first discovers that spies of Morgoth are watching the Red Hill. But instead of warning Turin, or anyone else for that matter, the hatred that he bore to Beleg led him now, in his darkened heart, to an evil resolve. One day, towards the end of the year, Mime left his home and he told the men in Barn-Danwedd that he was going with his son Ibun to search for roots for their winter store. But this was a lie. Mime's true purpose was to seek out these spying servants of Morgoth's and to lead them to Turin's hiding place. It would seem that Mime's hatred of all elves has overcome every other part of his personality. Except it's just not that simple. In the Children of Húrin standalone novel, which is pretty much what I'm going through in this series, we are told what I just said. Mime's true purpose was to seek out the servants of Morgoth and to lead them to Turin's hiding place. However, in the chapter of the Silmarillion, which deals with the tale of Turin, we get a slightly different version of events. In that story, we are told Mime the dwarf and Ibun his son went out from Barn-Danwedd to gather roots in the wild for their winter store, and they were taken captive by orcs. Then, for a second time, Mime promised to guide his enemies to his home on Amon Rudh. But yet he sought to delay the fulfillment of his promise, and demanded that Dor-Cúarthol should not be slain. To which the orc captain agrees. As I've already said, Morgoth servants are under very strict instructions to take Turin, son of Húrin, alive. And this version of Mime's betrayal, I think, portrays him, if not in a positive light, in a more positive light. In this rendition, he isn't a straight-up traitor, motivated solely by hatred towards one of the loveliest people in the entire story, let's be honest. He is instead just doing whatever it takes to stay alive. Not exactly heroic, but much more defensible than what the Children of Húrin novel tells us. And yet, still, there is another telling of this tale which casts another light upon Mime's treachery. You see, after that sentence from the Children of Húrin, where we are told Mime's true purpose was to seek out the servants of Morgoth, there is an asterisk leading to a footnote. The only footnote in the entire book. And what that footnote says is this. But another tale is told, which has it that Mime did not encounter the orcs with deliberate intent. It was the capture of his son and their threat to torture him that led Mime to his treachery. And in my mind, this footnote version makes Mime even more sympathetic than he is in the Silmarillion. In this version, he's not betraying the outlaws to save his own life, he's doing it to spare his last surviving son, and the last surviving petty dwarf anywhere in the world apart from himself, the torment of orc torture. If this version is, true, whatever true means, then I think it becomes quite hard to really condemn Mime's actions. Yes, he did a terrible thing, but it was to save his son from abject suffering. Or maybe it wasn't. The question remains, is Mime a vengeful villain who betrays our heroes due to an entirely misplaced hatred of an elf who has done nothing wrong? Is his treachery the result of self-preservation? Or is he a victim of the orcs forced to make a horrendous decision to spare his own son from a fate worse than death? Well, the answer to all three of those questions is yes. There is a strong argument born out of textual evidence that suggests each one of these seemingly entirely contradictory interpretations is correct. That's what makes Mime the Petty Dwarf such a fascinating figure. Anyway, whichever version we end up going with, there are a few things that remain the same. Most notably, Mime betrays the outlaws to the orcs, but he does so after attempting to impose certain conditions upon them. He makes 4 demands. Firstly, he insists that the orcs pay him the weight in iron of each man whom they catch or slay upon Amon Rudh, but for Beleg's capture, he wants to be paid the elf's weight in gold. Secondly, when Baron Danwedd is eventually rid of Turin and Beleg and Androg and the rest of the Gauderwaith, it must be given back to Mime, and no orcs are ever to harass him or his son ever again. Thirdly, although the orcs are to have free rein in the killing of the Gauderwaith, Mime demands that Beleg be left for him. The orcs are to beat the elf and to bind him, but they must let Mime be the one to kill him. And the final demand is that the Gauderwaith's captain, Nathan, or Dor-Cúarthol as the orcs know him, must be spared. Turin must be allowed to go free. Now, the emissaries of Morgoth readily agree to all these demands, but with no intention of fulfilling either the first or the second. Their orc captain thought that the fate of Beleg might as well be left to Mime, but as to letting Turin go free, alive to Angband were his orders, and there is no wiggle room on that. At this moment, Turin's capture and his torture in Angband before the very eyes of his father, potentially even providing the leverage in getting Húrin to spill the beans on Gondolin, that matters more to Morgoth than any number of outlaw elves or men or dwarves. But there's one more catch. The orcs agree to Mime's demands, at least they say they do, but their captain insists that Ibun be held by them as a hostage, as a means of ensuring Mime's cooperation when the time comes. We're actually explicitly told that when the orcs take Ibun, Mime became afraid, and tried to back out of his undertaking or else to escape. But the orcs had his son, and so Mime was obliged to guide them to Baron Danwedd. Thus was the House of Ransom betrayed. Now, I will talk about the Battle of Amon Rudh in just a minute, but before I do, I want to take a moment to speculate on the fate of Mime's son, Ibun. This is, chronologically, the very last time he is ever mentioned, and we know absolutely nothing about what became of him afterwards, except that in a later part of the story, which I won't spoil now, we are told that Mime is the last of his people, heavily implying that Ibun was either killed at the hands of these orcs, or he was killed by something else shortly after. And if we speculate that, yes, Ibun was killed by these orcs, and we accept the version of events where Mime sought out the orcs purposefully with the intention of betraying the outlaws for their role in the death of his other son, Keem, then that would mean that Mime ended up getting his second son killed in an attempt to avenge the death of his first son. As I say, this isn't explicitly stated by Tolkien, but I think it's a very poetic perspective on Mime's character. He is so consumed by hatred, albeit potentially justifiable hatred, and he is so unable to forgive that he ends up losing both of his sons and becoming the very last one of his kind. Perhaps it didn't need to be that way, but such is the self-destructive nature of hate. Anyway, the attack on Amon Rudh. Unlike some of Middle-earth's other battles, we don't actually know a huge amount about the details of this conflict, but it began with Mîm leading the orcs by secret ways up to the doors of Bar-en-Danwedd. Turin's watchman atop the summit of Amon Rudh did indeed see the orcs approaching, and he warned the others that battle was imminent, but by the time he did, it was already too late. Under Mîm's guidance, the orcs shot many of the Gâorwaith who stood atop the summit of the hill, and although Túrin and Beleg heroically led a sortie to try and slay the orcs still climbing the slopes, they were eventually driven back and forced to seal up the entrance to Bar-en-Danwedd with a great stone. They retreated into the caves, but as far as Túrin and Beleg knew, there was now no way out. However, once again, there is a single outlaw who knows something that the rest do not. Remember in the last video when I mentioned Androg wandering through the many tunnels and caves of Bar-en-Danwedd before stumbling upon a secret hidden stair that led him from Mîm's house up to the flat summit of Amon Rudh? Well, this is the reason that got a mention. You see, as the orcs try desperately to enter the caves, Androg leads Túrin and Beleg and the rest of the surviving Gâorwaith up to the summit of the Red Hill, where they can surprise the orcs that had already come there by the outer paths, drive their enemies over the edge of the cliffs, and hopefully still win the day. And for a while, this does seem to work. The orcs scaling the hill are held back, many are slain, and the remaining Gâorwaith form a defensive ring around the summit. However, unfortunately, the red peak of Amon Rudh is utterly without shelter, and so the orcs swiftly realize that they do not need to scale the sheer slopes or climb the outer paths. All they need to do is shoot the Gâorwaith from below. Many of the outlaws were slain in this fashion, but Tolkien actually tells us the most valiant of them all was Androg himself. Just as Mîm once declared with his curse, Androg the archer is shot by another archer, and he falls, mortally wounded, upon the summit of Amon Rudh. Eventually, with Androg dying, Túrin and Beleg are left with only 10 surviving outlaws. And although they do fight heroically and make a last stand, for every orc that is slain, more keep taking their place. And before too long, every last one of the Gâorwaith is killed, until Beleg and Túrin are the only two left. I imagine that the Dragon-helm and the Strongbow fought with utter fury to defend each other, but in the end, the multitude of orcs cast nets about them both. Beleg was wounded by orc blades, his wrists and his ankles were bound, and he was tied down to iron pins that the orcs had driven into the rock. Túrin was also bound, but he was taken by the orcs, alive, and back to Angband. Now, with the Dragon-helm as their captive, and the Strongbow left wounded and beaten atop the hill, the orcs entered Bar-en-Danwedd and they defiled it, ravaged it. But they did not find Mîm lurking in the caves. And so, eventually, the orcs departed from Amon Rudh, leaving Beleg there to die. and taking Turin as their prisoner, back to suffer the agony and anguish of Angband. Now, you might be wondering, well, what happened to all those other people, the men and elves who flocked to Dor-Cúarthol and dwelt in the guarded camps just south of the Red Hill? Well, the answer is, I don't know. Tolkien doesn't tell us, but I have a hypothesis. So, there is a character that I have not yet mentioned. He isn't ever mentioned in the Children of Húrin, or in the Silmarillion, or in the Unfinished Tales, but his name is Andvir. And Andvir is the son of Androg. Turns out Androg has had a son living with him among the Gawrwaith this whole time. But the only place where this son is ever mentioned is in an introductory note from a chapter of the War of the Jewels called Other Writings Not Forming Part of the Quenta Silmarillion. Anyway, the reason that I mention this Andvir, son of Androg, is because he is the only member of the Gawrwaith, apart from Beleg and Turin, who isn't killed in the fall of Amon Rudh. He is the only other survivor. In fact, I would say the reason that he even exists within the Legendarium is because there needs to be someone who survives to tell the story. Otherwise, how would we know about Turin and the Gawrwaith? Well, as it goes, Tolkien tells us that this Andvir told a Mannish poet called Dirhaval. And, according to Tolkien's very complex framing device, this dude, Dirhaval, is the guy who actually wrote the Narni Kin Húrin, the tale of the children of Húrin. And we are told that Andvir, son of Androg, told Dirhaval this story when he was an old man, living among other refugees in that sanctuary of the uttermost south, the havens protected by Círdan the shipwright and his ward, the future High King Gil-galad. So, my speculation would be that after the fall of Amon Rudh and the death of Androg, Andvir and some of the others who dwelt in the camps all around the Red Hill fled into the south, where many probably died, but at least some made it to the mouths of Sirion and joined the refugees under the care of Círdan. But I could not possibly end this video without explaining what becomes of Beleg. He is bound and beaten and wounded and waiting for death atop Amon Rudh, and I imagine in this moment his thoughts must have turned to Turin and the unimaginable torment that he is now doomed to endure. But then Mîm reveals himself. He draws a knife from his belt, and as he approaches Beleg's unmoving body, he sharpens it. He gloats in front of the elf, savouring his suffering, and walking among the bodies of the Gawrwaith who all lie dead due to his treachery. But just as Mîm is about to take his vengeance, about to murder Beleg Cuthalion in cold blood, one of the Gawrwaith bodies begins to crawl towards him. Androg the Archer is not quite dead. He seizes a sword and he thrusts it at Mîm only a moment before Mîm can kill Beleg. The dwarf shrieks, and in his fear he runs to the brink of the cliff and then disappears over the edge in his panic. He isn't killed, but we won't be seeing Mîm again for quite a long time. Anyway, with the very last strength of his life, Androg cuts the bonds that bind Beleg, and he releases him. Then Androg dies by Beleg's side. Here, in the moment of his death, Androg is, I think, to an extent, redeemed. That's not to say that all his negative actions are undone, but on the last day of his life, Androg is described as being the most valiant among the Gawrwaith. He avenges his brothers by getting rid of the treacherous dwarf, and in his very last act, he saves Beleg. He makes right what was wrong between them, and he ensures that Turin will not now be entirely alone. Androg knows that he cannot save his best friend and his captain, but he also knows that Beleg just might. And so, that is where I will end things for now. The outlaws are destroyed. Amon Rudh has fallen. Turin is taken by the enemy, and there is only one person who could get him back. Once again, Beleg Cuthalion has a quest to achieve. The stakes have never been higher, but he knows what he must do. The same thing he's been doing for years. Find Turin in the wild, kill those that would harm him, and bring him home. So, to make sure you don't miss the next part of this story, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to click like and leave a comment on this video if you enjoyed it. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and na vair melanin.